human chromosome 2 carries a scar, not metaphorically visibly structurally, in every cell of every living person on Earth. At its center, where a single anchor point called a centromere should exist, there are two, one active, one silent. And at its interior, where no chromosome should carry them, there are telomeres, the protective caps that belong only at the outermost ends, two separate chromosomes fused tip to tip with a precision that mainstream genetics acknowledges and has not fully ceased discussing. The structure is documented. What it means for the story of our origins remains quietly an open question. Tonight we follow that question through three traces. The first is written in your own biology and the architecture of that single chromosome, and in a classification of blood that roughly 15% of the human population carries a marker that shares no clear common ancestor with any other primate lineage on Earth. The second trace runs through the clay tablets of ancient Mesopotamia, where scribes pressed careful cuneiform into wet clay and recorded the activities of beings they called the Anunnaki beings, who according to those texts arrived here with a purpose, encountered a problem and solved it in a way the texts describe with unusual specificity. The third trace moves through symbol and structure and organ buried in the geometric center of the human skull, a pine cone carved in Assyrian stone held at a precise angle to the head of a kneeling king, and a resonance detected beneath the lunar surface that produced a result no one on the mission had anticipated. We will not resolve what these traces mean. That is not what this space is for, but we will hold them together long enough to feel the shape of the question they share. The question stated plainly is this: if the anomaly in chromosome 2 is real, and it appears in every peer-reviewed genomic map without exception, then what does its particular structure suggest about how it came to be? Mainstream evolutionary biology offers a mechanism. Telomeric fusion, a process in which two ancestral chromosomes join end to end during cell division. The mechanism is known. It is documented across species. It does not require intervention. What it requires is a founding population small enough that the new arrangement could propagate a bottleneck, an isolation event, a moment when a very small group of individuals carried a reorganized genome forward into every human being who would ever live. That explanation is coherent. Most geneticists accept it, and they are not wrong to. And yet the specific geometry of chromosome 2, the dual centromeres, the internal telomeres, the compression of material that appears reorganized rather than simply joined, has produced a secondary literature of researchers who find the standard model incomplete. Not disproven, not discarded, incomplete. A structure this precise, some argue, suggests selection pressure at minimum and something else at most. The detail is small and it refuses to go away. To understand why that incompleteness has generated more than fringe speculation, why it intersects with a serious and ongoing debate in archaeogenetics about the timing and mechanism of human cognitive emergence, we need to move laterally, away from the sequencer and towards a library several thousand years older. In the late 19th century, archaeologists excavating the ruins of Nineveh recovered a cache of clay tablets that scholars would eventually identify as portions of the Atrahasis Epic, a Babylonian creation narrative older than Genesis, older than any written source in the Western tradition. The Atrahasis described with some specificity a council of beings convening around a labor crisis. It described a decision to create a worker species. It described the process in iterative terms, failed attempts, malformed outcomes, biological material that did not hold. And then it described a stabilization, a model that worked. Scholars read this as mythology and rightly approach it that way. The language is theological, the structure is ritual. No mainstream Assyriologist argues that the Atrahasis is a technical document, but the iterative quality of the account, the failed prototypes, the adjustment, the eventual success, has drawn the attention of researchers who notice something specific. The text reads less like a cosmological poem and more like a procedural record. Not proof of anything, a pattern in the telling. Woven through both the genetic record and the Mesopotamian texts is a third thread quieter than either, and perhaps more difficult to hold steadily in mind. Across ancient Sumer, Assyria, Egypt, and in the courtyard of the Vatican in Rome, the same symbol appears with unusual consistency. A pine cone held at the level of the forehead presented by a god or a king toward the head of a human figure. Modern neuroscience has in the past 2 decades identified the pineal gland, an organ buried at the geometric center of the human brain shaped precisely like a pine cone, as containing piezo, electric calcite microcrystal structures capable of generating an electrical charge under mechanical pressure. What this means for human consciousness remains genuinely contested, and the researchers who study it are careful to say so. But the convergence between an ancient symbol repeated across cultures with no known contact and a recently documented anatomical property has been noted by people working in both fields. Neither community has a complete explanation for the overlap. These 3 traces, the genomic anomaly, the ancient text, the symbol carved in stone across 5 continents, do not converge into a single clean answer. They may not converge at all. What they do is preserve the shape of something, a recurring suggestion encoded in very different materials pointing toward the same unanswered question about what we are, and whether the record of how we came to be has been fully read. So we begin where the evidence is most concrete. With the biology, with the chromosome, with the one detail that no one disputes, only interprets differently depending on what they are willing to leave open. The first trace waits there. What the record was before we read it. In the winter of 1872, a 32-year-old self-taught cuneiformist named George Smith sat in the basement of the British Museum surrounded by fragments of fired clay, no larger than his palm. He'd been working through the Kuyunjik collection, thousands of tablet pieces excavated from the ruins of Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, on the eastern bank of the Tigris, cataloguing, cross-referencing, assembling broken edges against broken edges with the particular patience that archival work demands and rarely rewards. Most of the tablets were administrative. Lists of grain allocations, records of tribute, paid inventories of temple property stretching across dynasties. The work was meticulous and largely unremarkable, the kind of labour that fills a scholar's years without producing a single sentence worth repeating to anyone outside the field. And then, on an afternoon he would later describe as the strangest of his professional life, Smith read a fragment that stopped him completely. The fragment described a flood, a man warned by a god, a boat constructed to specific dimensions, animals taken aboard in pairs, a bird released to search for dry land and returning with mud on its feet. It was older than the Book of Genesis by centuries, possibly by a millennium, and it had been sitting in the British Museum basement uncatalogued for years before anyone with the language to read it happened to look. Smith reportedly stood from his desk, and by the account of a colleague present in the room, began pacing in a state of visible agitation, not the agitation of alarm, but of someone whose mental landscape has just been rearranged faster than he can follow. That moment, a man in a cold basement holding a piece of clay that quietly repositioned the timeline of recorded human memory, is a useful place to orient ourselves tonight. Not because it resolves anything about where the story we are tracing ultimately leads, but because it illustrates something important about how the ancient Mesopotamian record behaves as a body of evidence. It surfaces slowly across decades of excavation and decades more of translation. It rewards patience in the reader the same way it rewarded it in the archivist. And when it does speak with something approaching clarity, it tends to say things that sit at an angle to what the surrounding historical record had prepared us to expect. The tablets Smith was working through, and the far larger collections that followed from systematic excavations at Nippur-ur-Lagash and Eridu throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, collectively represent the oldest sustained written tradition on Earth. Sumerian cuneiform pressed into wet clay with a beveled reed stylus, and they're then fired or sun-dried for preservation dates to approximately 3200 BCE in its earliest clearly recognizable form. The language itself is classified by modern linguists as an isolate. Its grammar, its phonology, its morphological structure carry no demonstrable genetic relationship to any other known language family. Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, the Germanic and Slavic tongues, the Semitic languages of the ancient Near East, all of these belong to broader families traceable through comparative reconstruction to common ancestors. Sumerian traces to nothing. It simply begins fully formed in the written record without a documented ancestor and without a clearly documented descendant. What the Sumerians committed to clay across those thousands of tablets was varied and sometimes surprising in its range. Temple hymns, mathematical tables predating Greek mathematics by more than 1,000 years, medical prescriptions listing plant compounds and procedures still partially legible to pharmacologists, legal codes establishing principles of contract and liability, and threaded through all of it a body of narrative literature describing the activities of beings. The text called the Anunnaki, a term rendered variously as those of royal blood, or those who from heaven to earth came depending on which cuneiform signs the translator weights most heavily, and which scholarly tradition informs their reading. The Anunnaki in the Sumerian texts are not the remote featureless divinities of later monotheistic tradition. They hold councils and disagree in them. They experience fatigue and express it. They eat and sleep and assign tasks to subordinates with this procedural specificity of administrators rather than the grandeur of supernatural agents. Their decisions as the texts render them carry the texture of governance contested, negotiated, subject to revision. Among the most complete of the surviving Anunnaki narratives is a text scholars call the Atrahasis Epic, reconstructed across tablet fragments recovered from multiple sites and substantially assembled by the mid-20th century through the work of Assyriologists including Wilfrid Lambert and Alan Millard. The Atrahasis describes a period prior to the existence of human beings during which the maintenance of the earth, the digging of irrigation canals, the tending of agricultural land, the physical infrastructure of an ordered world fell to a subordinate class of Anunnaki called the Agigi. The Agigi worked, the text says, for 40 years before their endurance broke. They burned their tools. They surrounded the residence of Enlil, the chief administrator of the Anunnaki Council. They demanded relief from labour that the text describes as excessive as damaging as something no being should be required to sustain indefinitely. The solution proposed in response the fashioning of a new being from existing biological material, combined with a divine imprint, specifically to absorb the labour burden is presented in the text, not as an act of miraculous creation, but as the resolution of an administrative crisis through technical means. This is the framing that interests certain researchers and that mainstream scholarship approaches with measured caution for reasons that deserve full acknowledgement. The Atrahasis is a literary document shaped by the conventions of ancient Near Eastern narrative. Formal repetition, divine speech in elevated register, cosmological processes rendered through the actions of personified agents. Reading it as a factual record requires interpretive moves that most Assyriologists decline to make, and their caution is not a failure of imagination, but a professional discipline earned through long engagement with how ancient texts encode meaning. Literature does not transmit history transparently. It refracts it through the priorities, the anxieties, and the symbolic vocabularies of the culture that produced it. The Atrahasis tells us with reasonable confidence something about how the Sumerians understood their own origins and their relationship to the divine. Whether it preserves anything of what actually occurred in the deep human past is a genuinely separate question, and one that the text alone cannot answer. What the Sumerian record does establish with a clarity that requires no interpretive stretch is a foundation, a civilization that emerged with an unusual speed, relative to what preceded it, that produced a written literature of unusual specificity about human origins, and that placed at the centre of that literature a relationship between the human and the more than human that was neither simple nor serene. That foundation is where tonight's traces begin. The first of them, however, does not start with a clay tablet or a creation myth. It starts with a number, a single structural anomaly embedded in every cell of every person who will ever hear these words, and with the question of what that number by itself suggests. The scar in the second chromosome. The number is 46. Every human being alive carries 46 chromosomes in the nucleus of nearly every cell in their body. 23 pairs, each one a densely packed length of DNA, encoding the instructions for the organism that reads them. That number is not remarkable on its own. What makes it remarkable is the context in which it sits. Chimpanzees carry 48 chromosomes, gorillas carry 48, orangutans carry 48. Every non-human great ape that has been genetically mapped carries 48 chromosomes organized into 24 pairs, and the evolutionary relationship between those species and our own is not seriously disputed by anyone working in modern biology. The common ancestor we share with chimpanzees lived by current estimates somewhere between 6 and 7 million years ago. in the span of geological time that is not a long separation. And yet somewhere in that interval the human lineage arrived at 46 chromosomes, while every other branch of the ape family remained at 48. 2 chromosomes, by the accounting of the standard model, did not disappear. They fused. The mechanism proposed to explain this is called telomeric fusion, and it is a documented biological process, not a hypothesis invented to fill a gap, but an event type observed across multiple species and confirmed through comparative genomic analysis. Chromosomes are capped at both ends by repetitive sequences of nucleotides called telomeres, which function something like the plastic aglets on some shoelaces. They protect the chromosome from degradation and prevent its ends from bonding to adjacent chromosomes during normal cell division. In a telomeric fusion event, the protective caps of 2 separate chromosomes bond to each other end to end, merging what were 2 distinct genetic structures into a single longer one. The result carries the original telomeric sequences of both parent chromosomes, which means the fused chromosome retains internal telomeres located not at its tips, but at its center, precisely where the 2 originals were joined. This is not a theoretical prediction. It is an observable structural signature, and it is exactly what geneticists find when they examine human chromosome 2 under sufficient resolution. The evidence for the fusion is by the standards of molecular biology unusually clean. The internal telomeric sequences sit at precisely the location where the junction of 2 ancestral chromosomes would be predicted to occur based on comparison with chimpanzee chromosomes 2A and 2B. The alignment between the human chromosome and its proposed ancestral counterparts is detailed enough that researchers can identify which sections correspond to which original structure. A 2002 paper in the journal Genome Research and subsequent work building on it has traced this correspondence with enough precision to satisfy the majority of geneticists working in primate evolution. The fusion happened. On that point, the scientific literature does not meaningfully disagree. What the literature is somewhat quieter about is the geometry of the centromere. A centromere is the constriction point of a chromosome, the anchor site where spindle fibers attach during cell division, pulling the duplicated chromosomes apart so each daughter cell receives the correct complement. A functional chromosome has 1 active centromer. Human chromosome 2 has 2 centromeric regions, 1 inherited from each of the ancestral chromosomes that contributed to the fusion. 1 is active, performing its normal function in every cell division that has occurred in every human body since the fusion propagated through the ancestral population. The other is present, but silenced, its sequences intact, its function suppressed through a process called centromer inactivation, which prevents the chromosome from being pulled in 2 directions simultaneously during division. The silenced centromere is sometimes described in the technical literature as a vestigial structure, a remnant that persists without consequence because silencing it costs the organism nothing, and removing it entirely would require a more disruptive genetic event than maintaining the suppression. This explanation is coherent. Geneticists working in chromosome biology accept it as adequate, and yet the detail itself, a second anchor point present and intact but deliberately not operating, is the kind of structural observation that, once noted, does not simplify the picture as much as it might initially appear to. The fusion event mainstream genetics argues originated in a single individual or a very small number of individuals within a founding population. For the fusion to propagate to every living human being, that founding population would need to have been small enough that the new chromosomal arrangement could spread through genetic drift, the process by which random variation becomes fixed in a population simply because the population is too small for statistical averaging to counteract it. This is not an implausible scenario. Population bottlenecks in which a species is reduced to a small founding group that then expands are documented throughout evolutionary history, and the genetic evidence for at least 1 severe human population bottleneck exists independently of the chromosome 2 question. The fusion and the bottleneck may have been coincident, or one may have contributed to the other. The models allow for it. What they do not yet fully account for is the precision of the outcome. The fact that the fusion produced not a scrambled or degraded chromosome, but a functional one carrying the genetic content of both ancestral structures in an arrangement that could support rather than impair the normal operations of cell division. Fusions in other species have been documented producing sterile or non-viable offspring. This one produced us. There is a second anomaly in the human blood record that sits alongside the chromosome question without connecting to it through any mechanism that current biology has fully explained. Approximately 15% of the human population carries blood that is classified as Rh negative, a designation indicating the absence of a specific protein, the rhesus D antigen, on the surface of red blood cells. The remaining 85% carry the antigen and are classified as Rh positive. In itself, this variation is unremarkable. Human populations carry many blood type variations. What makes the Rh negative classification biologically unusual is what happens when an Rh negative mother carries an Rh positive fetus. Her immune system identifies the fetal blood cells, her own child's blood, as foreign material and mounts an antibody response against them, a condition called hemolytic disease of the newborn. The body, in other words, treats its own offspring as an intruder. This does not occur in any consistent way between other maternal fetal blood type combinations. It is specific to the Rh negative mother carrying an Rh positive child, and the biological explanation for why this particular incompatibility exists, why it was not selected against in populations where it produces potentially fatal outcomes for offspring, remains a subject of ongoing discussion in evolutionary medicine rather than a settled question. Whether the Rh negative anomaly and the chromosome 2 fusion are related, coincidental, or entirely independent features of the human genome is not something the available evidence can currently determine. What they share is a quality of structural unusualness, a departure from the pattern that surrounds them, that has generated a literature of questions that the standard model has answered partially but not completely. 2 chromosomes became 1. A blood classification behaves as though it originated from a lineage that did not fully integrate with the broader primate tree. The observations are real. Their meaning remains for now genuinely unsettled. The second trace approaches the same question from a different direction entirely from the other side of 5,000 years of fired clay, and the careful hands of a scribe who wrote down in the oldest literary language we possess a description of how a new kind of being was made. What the clay said before the theologians arrived. A careful reader of the Atrahasis Epic approaching the text without prior exposure to either its religious reception history or its modern fringe interpretations might notice as something that neither tradition tends to emphasize. The creation of the human being in the Atrahasis is not described as instantaneous. It is not a divine word spoken into darkness, not a gesture from which a completed form springs whole. It's a process, iterative, adjusted across attempts producing outcomes that the text itself characterizes as failures before arriving at one that holds. The goddess Ninmah, working alongside Enki in a location the text calls the Bit Shimti, a phrase rendered by different translators as the house of fashioning, the house of destiny, or simply the place of making shapes beings from a clay described as the flesh of a god mixed with the substance of the earth. Some of what she produces cannot sustain life, some cannot reproduce, some are formed incorrectly, in ways the text enumerates with a specificity unusual for cosmological myth feet, that phase backward ribs that cannot hold breath bodies without the capacity for procreation. These failed forms are described, catalogued and set aside. The process continues until a stable form is achieved. The language of the text in this section reads less like the record of a miracle and more like the notation of someone who has been through a laboratory procedure enough times to know what failure looks like and why it matters to document it. This quality of the Atrahasis, its procedural register in the creation sequence, is not unique within the broader Mesopotamian literary tradition. The text known as the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, recovered from the same Nineveh excavations that yielded George Smith's Flood tablet, describes the fashioning of humanity from the blood of a slain deity mixed with clay, a narrative that has clear thematic parallels to the Atrahasis, but a different emotional texture, grander, more formally ceremonial, less concerned with the mechanics of what actually occurred. The Atrahasis, by contrast, retains a quality of procedural groundedness that several scholars of ancient Near Eastern literature, including Tikva Frye-Mackenzie, writing in the 1980s, identified as among its most distinctive features. The text seems interested in how the thing was done, not only in the cosmological significance of the fact that it was done, Whether that interest reflects a literary convention, a theological argument, or the preservation of something older than either, is a question the text itself does not resolve. The Akkadian term used in the Atrahasis for the being that results from the creation process is Lulu, sometimes rendered as primitive worker, sometimes as mixed one, with the second translation weighted by scholars who read the term as carrying an explicit reference to the hybrid nature of the created being. The Sumerian equivalent Adamu appears in related texts and has drawn considerable attention from researchers interested in cross-cultural parallels, given its phonetic proximity to the Hebrew Adam. Most comparative linguists treat this proximity as a borrowing relationship Hebrew tradition, drawing on the older Mesopotamian source material during the periods of cultural contact that the historical record documents, rather than as evidence of a shared original referent. That is the standard scholarly position, and it is well supported by the broader pattern of Mesopotamian influence on early Hebrew literature. What it does not explain, because it is not trying to, is why the Sumerian Adamu is described in the creation text with the specificity of biological detail, the materials used, the proportion of divine to earthly substance, the adjustments made across failed attempts that has no clear parallel in the creation narratives of other ancient civilizations. The Adapa myth, a shorter text recovered in fragmented form from both Nineveh and the archive at Tel El Amarna in Egypt, extends the Atrahasis narrative in a direction that has generated its own secondary literature of interpretation. Adapa is described as the first of the Apkallu, the seven sages, the antediluvian wise men, who in Mesopotamian tradition brought the arts of civilization to humanity before the flood. He is fashioned by Enki, with what the text calls wide understanding, taught the secrets of heaven and earth, given the capacity for language and reasoning, at a level that places him in the narrative's own accounting close to the divine. The story that follows involves Adapa breaking the wing of the south wind, an act described in the text through language that has been read both as a straightforward mythological event and by a smaller number of researchers as a description of interfering with a mechanical object using knowledge he should not have possessed. He is summoned before Anu, the highest authority in the Anunnaki hierarchy. He is offered the bread of life and the water of life immortality in the text's symbolic economy, and refuses them on the advice of Enki, who has told him the food will be deadly. The twist when it arrives is that the food was not deadly. Anu intended to elevate Adapa. Enki's warning was either a deception or a miscommunication, and the text does not clarify which. Adapa returns to Earth, mortal carrying wide understanding, but a finite lifespan, and the story closes without resolving whether Enki's intervention was protective or something more complicated. What the Atrahasis, the Adapa myth, and the related corpus of Anunnaki narrative literature share across their different genres, their different periods of composition, their different theological emphases is a consistent structural feature. The human being in all of these texts is neither fully of the earth nor fully of whatever produced it. It is a compound. It carries something from both sides of its origin, and that compound nature is treated in the text not as a source of simple dignity, but as the origin of a particular kind of tension between capacity and limitation, between knowledge and mortality, between what the being was designed to be and what it turned out to be capable of becoming. The third trace does not come from a text at all. It comes from stone and from a symbol carved into that stone across 5 separate ancient civilizations that, by the chronology we currently accept, had no means of communicating with one another. The same shape carved separately. Consider what it would mean to find the same specific image, not a general symbol like a circle or a line, but a precise botanically accurate rendering of a pine cone held at a specific angle toward a specific part of the human body, carved independently into the monumental art of cultures separated by thousands of miles and, in several cases, by thousands of years. The pine cone is not an obvious symbol. It is not the sun which every civilization in the Northern Hemisphere worshipped in some form, because every civilization in the Northern Hemisphere noticed that warmth and agriculture depend on it. It is not water or fire, or the crescent of the moon. It is a seed-bearing structure from a conifer structurally complex, botanically specific, and not obviously metaphorical in the way that more common religious symbols tend to be. And yet it appears rendered with care, placed in positions of deliberate prominence in Sumerian cylinder seals, in Assyrian palace reliefs at Nimrud, in the iconography of the Egyptian god Osiris, in the ceremonial regalia of certain Mesoamerican traditions, and at the center of the largest open courtyard in Vatican City, where a bronze pine cone nearly 4 meters tall has stood since antiquity, its origins traced to a Roman fountain that itself incorporated an older symbolic tradition whose precise source remains debated among historians of art. The Assyrian reliefs at Nimrud are among the most frequently cited instances of the symbol in the ancient Near Eastern context, and they are worth examining in some detail because the specificity of what they depict is not easily explained away as coincidence of form. The reliefs carved during the reign of Ashurnasirpal II in the 9th century BCE and now distributed across several museum collections, including the British Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, show winged figures. The Epkalu, the divine beings associated in Mesopotamian tradition with the transmission of knowledge and civilization, holding a pine cone in one hand and a bucket-like vessel in the other. The pine cone is consistently held at the level of the forehead of a human or royal figure who stands before the Apkallu in a posture suggesting reception rather than offering. The figure with the pine cone is not receiving something from the human, it is directing something toward the human's head. The gesture repeated with remarkable consistency across dozens of relief panels from the same period has been interpreted by art historians as a ritual purification scene, by some as a reference to pollination as a metaphor for divine blessing, and by a smaller number of researchers as something more anatomically specific, a reference to the organ that sits at the geometric center of the human brain, shaped, as it happens, almost exactly like a pine cone. The pineal gland was identified and named by ancient Greek physicians who noticed its distinctive form and speculated about its function. René Descartes in the 17th century described it as the seat of the soul, the point at which the immaterial mind interfaces with the material body, a claim that modern neuroscience does not accept in its original form, but that has not been entirely replaced by a more satisfying alternative. The pineal gland produces melatonin regulating circadian rhythms and sleep-wake cycles. It responds to light through a pathway that bypasses conscious awareness. In some vertebrates, it is directly photosensitive, a functional third eye sitting beneath the skull and registering changes in ambient light directly. In humans, this direct photosensitivity appears to have been suppressed in the course of evolution, though the structural machinery for it remains partially present, a vestigial capacity that the organism has not entirely discarded. What research in the past 2 decades has added to this picture is the discovery of calcite microcrystals within the fluid-filled interior of the human pineal gland piezoelectric structures, meaning structures capable of generating a small electrical charge in response to mechanical pressure or acoustic vibration. The research group, led by biophysicist Sidney Lang at SUNY, published findings on pineal calcite crystals in 2002 that have since been replicated and extended by other teams, with the functional significance of the crystals remaining at present genuinely uncertain. They are present. They are piezoelectric. What, if anything, they transduce, and whether that transduction has any relationship to perception consciousness, or whatever the ancient world meant when it placed a pine cone at the center of its iconographic vocabulary, is a question that current neuroscience is not yet positioned to answer definitively. The complication that this trace introduces, the reason it belongs in this chapter rather than alongside the more straightforwardly evidential material of the preceding 2, is its resistance to a clean interpretive frame. The chromosome fusion can be examined through the protocols of molecular biology. The Atrahasis can be read through the conventions of ancient Near Eastern philology. Both fields have established methodologies for assessing what the evidence supports and what it does not. The pine cone symbol distributed across cultures with no documented contact and associated with a specific anatomical structure whose functional significance remains partially unknown, sites in a different epistemic position. It is too consistent to dismiss as coincidence and too ambiguous to constitute evidence of anything specific. It points in a direction without specifying what lies there. And that quality of a pattern that is real but not legible, visible but not readable, is what makes it useful to hold alongside the other 2 traces rather than ahead of or behind them. What all 3 traces share when placed next to each other for the first time is not a single conclusion, but a single shape, a recurring suggestion that the boundary between what we are and what produced us may be less settled than the standard account assumes. That convergence is where the next chapter begins. 3 traces, 1 silhouette, Pull back far enough from any 3 points and a line may emerge between them, or it may not. The discipline of working with fragmentary evidence, whether genetic, textual, or iconographic, requires holding that uncertainty genuinely not as a rhetorical gesture toward humility, but as an actual constraint on what can be claimed. What the 3 traces examined so far share is not a conclusion. They share a quality of structural unusualness, each in its own domain, that points in a similar direction without quite resolving into a single image. It is worth pausing here before the narrative moves into more complicated territory to lay them next to each other and observe what the arrangement produces. The first trace is biological. Human chromosome 2 carries the structural signature of a fusion event, internal telomeres, a silent secondary centromere, a compression of genetic material from 2 ancestral chromosomes into a single functioning structure that appears in every human being without exception. The fusion is real, documented, and explained by mainstream genetics through a mechanism called telomeric fusion operating on a small founding population. What the explanation leaves partially open is the question of precision fusions of this type when they occur in other species frequently produce sterile or non-viable offspring. This one propagated successfully through an entire lineage. The mechanism is known. The specific outcome remains in the literature of evolutionary biology a subject of ongoing modelling rather than a settled case. The second trace is textual, the Atrahasis Epic. The oldest substantially complete creation narrative in the written record describes the fashioning of a new being through a process that the text renders in procedural rather than miraculous language. Iterative attempts documented failures, eventual stabilization of a form described as compound partly of the earth, partly of something the text calls divine substance, and carrying in its compound nature a tension between capacity and limitation that the narrative treats not as incidental, but as the central fact about what was made. The text is a literary document shaped by conventions and theological priorities that make any direct reading as historical record methodologically unjustifiable, and yet its procedural register its interest in how the creation was accomplished rather than only in what the creation means is a feature of the text that even scholars resistant to non-mythological readings have noted as distinctive within the ancient Near Eastern literary tradition. The third trace is iconographic and anatomical. A symbol, the pine cone held at forehead level toward a receiving human figure, appears in the monumental art of cultures separated by geography and time in ways that the current historical record does not easily connect through documented channels of transmission. The organ that the symbol may reference, the pineal gland, sits at the geometric center of the human brain and has been found to contain piezoelectric calcite microcrystals, whose functional significance remains genuinely uncertain. The convergence between the ancient symbol and the recently documented anatomical detail is real. What it means, whether it means anything beyond coincidence of form, is a question that neither neuroscience nor the history of art has yet answered in a way that satisfies both fields simultaneously. What happens when these 3 observations are placed alongside each other is not that they prove a common origin or confirm a shared narrative. What happens is more subtle and in certain ways more interesting than proof. Each trace considered alone exists within a margin of uncertainty that its respective discipline can accommodate without significant discomfort. The chromosome fusion is unusual but explicable. The Atrahasis is evocative but literary. The pinecone distribution is striking but potentially coincidental. The disciplines that study these things have developed frameworks precisely designed to hold this kind of uncertainty in productive suspension, and those frameworks are not wrong to do so. That is how knowledge advances, by holding anomalies within existing models long enough to determine whether the anomaly requires a revision of the model or merely a refinement of its parameters. But the 3 anomalies placed next to each other produce something that the individual frameworks are not designed to address: a convergence of direction across entirely separate bodies of evidence pointing toward the same unresolved question about the boundary between what we are and what produced us. The genome suggests a discontinuity in the primate lineage that the standard model explains through mechanism without fully accounting for outcome. The oldest creation text in the written record describes that discontinuity in procedural terms as the deliberate act of biological modification, with a specificity that exceeds the requirements of theological narrative. And the monumental art of multiple ancient civilizations marks with unusual consistency and anatomical structure, whose properties are only now being characterized in biological terms, and whose functional role in human consciousness remains one of the genuinely open questions in neuroscience. 3 separate observations, 3 separate disciplines, one silhouette forming at the edge of what each of them can currently illuminate. This is not proof of anything. It is a pattern, and patterns of this kind, where independent lines of inquiry arrive at the same blank space without being able to fill it, are precisely the kind of observation that scientific progress at its most honest takes seriously rather than dismiss it. The question the pattern produces is not new. It is very old, older than the tablets that first encoded it in writing. What exactly were we made from and by what, and did the process leave a record that we are only now becoming equipped to read? That question is where the episode's central tension lives, and it is about to become more complicated because the mainstream accounts of all 3 traces are more robust than a cursory reading might suggest, and the complications they introduce deserve to be held with the same care as the anomalies that preceded them. What the careful mind holds against itself, there is a particular kind of intellectual honesty that is harder to practice than it appears, the kind that requires taking the counter-argument not as an obstacle to be navigated around, but as a genuine alternative that might be correct. The 3 traces assembled in the preceding chapters each carry their own weight of anomaly, their own quality of pointing beyond what the standard account fully explains. But the standard account exists for reasons that are not merely institutional or conventional. It exists because the evidence examined carefully and without prior commitment to a particular conclusion supports it not completely, not without remainder, but substantially enough that dismissing it would require ignoring the majority of what the relevant disciplines have learned over the past century of serious work. The counter-arguments deserve that kind of attention, not as a formality before returning to the more interesting material, but as a genuine check on whether the pattern observed is real or as an artifact of selective attention. Begin with the chromosome. The telomeric fusion model for chromosome 2 is not a placeholder explanation invented to forestall more interesting possibilities. It is a mechanistic account supported by multiple independent lines of molecular evidence, each of which is testable and has been tested. The internal telomeric sequences at the chromosome's fusion point align precisely with what comparative genomics predicts based on the structure of chimpanzee chromosomes 2A and 2B. The alignment is detailed enough that researchers can identify individual repetitive units and trace their correspondence across species. The silent centromer, which might appear to suggest deliberate inactivation, is in fact a documented outcome of the centromer inactivation process that occurs naturally in fusion events, when 2 centromeres compete for spindle attachment. During cell division, 1 is typically suppressed through epigenetic mechanisms that do not require any external intervention to operate. The process is understood at the molecular level. It has been observed in other species undergoing similar chromosomal rearrangements. And the concern about viability, the observation that fusions in other lineages sometimes produce sterile or non-viable offspring, is addressed in the evolutionary model by the population genetics of small founding groups where a novel chromosomal arrangement can become fixed through drift, even if it initially reduces fitness slightly, provided the reduction is not catastrophic. The fusion on this account is unusual in its outcome but not in its mechanism, and the distance between unusual and inexplicable is one that evolutionary biology has crossed many times before with less evidence than is available here. The Atrahasis presents a different kind of counter-argument, one that operates not at the level of mechanism but at the level of interpretation. The procedural quality of the creation narrative, which several chapters ago was offered as a distinctive feature that exceeds the requirements of cosmological myth, is explicable in terms of the literary conventions of ancient Mesopotamian tradition. Scholars of the ancient Near East have long noted that Mesopotamian theological literature tends toward the concrete and the specific in ways that Greek or later monotheistic religious texts do not. The gods of Sumer and Babylon are administrative beings who work within a structured cosmos rather than supernatural agents who stand outside it, and the narratives about them reflect this. They describe divine activity in terms of procedures, materials, and outcomes, because that is how the Mesopotamian theological imagination construed the relationship between the divine and the physical world. The iterative quality of the Atrahasis creation sequence, the failed attempts, the adjustments, the eventual stabilization may reflect not a memory of an actual biological process, but the Mesopotamian understanding of how any difficult task is accomplished divine or otherwise through effort, through failure, through revision. Reading the text as a technical document requires importing a framework of interpretation that the text itself read within its own cultural context does not obviously invite. The pine cone symbol is the most straightforwardly explicable of the three anomalies, and it is worth saying so directly. Pine trees and their cones carry consistent symbolic associations across many cultures independently. Longevity, fertility, regeneration, because pine trees are long-lived, because their cones contain seeds in protective structures that remain viable long after the parent tree has died, and because conifer forests were dominant features of the landscapes in which many early civilizations developed. The recurrence of the pine cone as a symbol of divine blessing or spiritual potency does not require a shared transmission of esoteric anatomical knowledge from a common ancient source. It may simply reflect the tendency of human symbolic thought to reach for the same natural forms when expressing the same abstract ideas, because those natural forms are present in the same environments and carry the same observable qualities. The association of the symbol with the head or forehead in Assyrian iconography is suggestive in retrospect given what we now know about the pineal gland's location, but retrospective pattern recognition, finding a meaningful connection between an ancient symbol and a modern discovery. Because the modern discovery makes the symbol newly interesting is a well-documented cognitive tendency that does not constitute evidence of an actual historical link. The mind that knows about the pineal gland reads the Nimrud reliefs differently than the mind that does not. That difference in reading tells us something about perception, but it may not tell us anything about ancient Assyria. These counter-arguments are substantial. They are not the arguments of people unwilling to entertain unusual ideas. They are the arguments of people who have spent careers in close contact with the actual evidence and have found the standard models sufficient for what the evidence strictly examined requires. That is worth holding genuinely not as a rhetorical concession before resuming the thread of anomaly, but as an actual constraint on the confidence with which any alternative account can be advanced. And yet each counter-argument, adequate as it is within its own domain, leaves something in place that it does not dissolve. The evolutionary model explains the mechanism of the chromosome fusion without fully accounting for why this particular fusion produced a lineage of the cognitive complexity that humans represent when comparable fusions in other species have not produced comparable outcomes. The literary convention argument explains why the Atrahasis reads as it does without explaining why it reads more like a procedural record than any other creation narrative of comparable antiquity. The cross-cultural symbolism argument explains why pine cones recur without explaining why the gesture of holding them at forehead level toward another figure recurs with such consistency across traditions that had no documented contact. The counter-arguments close the door on certainty. They do not close the door on the question. The pattern remains open, not confirmed, not dismissed, but genuinely unresolved in the way that the most interesting questions in any field tend to be. And it is from that position, after taking the skeptic's best case seriously and finding it necessary but not quite sufficient, that the inquiry continues. The leap that the timeline cannot absorb. A stone tool recovered from a site in South Africa called Blombos Cave sits in a glass case at the Aziko South African Museum in Cape Town and does not look at first examination like the kind of object that should disturb anything. It is a piece of ochre iron rich rock of a deep reddish brown, approximately 3 centimeters long, with a geometric pattern of cross-hatched lines engraved deliberately into one of its flat faces. The engraving is not accidental. It is not the result of tool use or wear. It is a pattern made for its own sake, imposed on the surface of the rock by a hand that understood abstraction, that understood at minimum the idea of making a mark that refers to something other than itself. The Blombos ochre has been dated to approximately 75,000 years ago. It is by the current consensus of archaeologists working on the question of behavioural modernity among the earliest physical evidence of symbolic thought in the human record, and it arrives in the timeline with a suddenness that the preceding hundreds of thousands of years of human tool-making do not quite prepare us for. This is the detail that the skeptic chapter, comprehensive as it was, does not dissolve. The counter-arguments offered in the preceding pages are adequate to their specific domains. They explain the mechanism of the chromosome fusion, the literary conventions of the Atrahasis, the cross-cultural logic of the pine cone symbol. What they are not designed to address, because it belongs to a different field with a different set of questions, is the pattern that emerges when the biological and archaeological records are placed alongside each other, and the timeline is examined with careful attention to rate of change. Homo sapiens, as an anatomically recognizable species, appears in the fossil record by approximately 300,000 years ago. For the first 150,000 years or so of that record, the behavioral evidence, the tools, the evidence of resource used, the traces of social organization is not dramatically different from what preceded it. And then in the span of perhaps 50,000 years, something changes. Symbolic objects appear, cave paintings appear, long-distance trade networks appear, evidenced by marine shells found hundreds of kilometers inland, and obsidian from volcanic sources carried across territories with no obvious utilitarian motivation. Burial with grave goods appears the deliberate placement of objects with the dead, which implies a relationship to mortality that cannot be explained by immediate survival needs. The behavioral package that archaeologists call modernity arrives in the record not gradually, but in what the timescale of evolution registers as a compressed event. The standard explanation for this behavioral leap, sometimes called the cognitive revolution, sometimes the Great Leap Forward, is neurological reorganization. The proposal, advanced in various forms by researchers including Richard Klein and in a more contested version by Noam Chomsky's collaborators, is that a genetic mutation affecting brain organization possibly related to the capacity for recursive language produced the cognitive flexibility that underlies the symbolic thought, long-range planning, and the full behavioral repertoire of modern humans. The mutation would have occurred in Africa, spread through the population rapidly because of its adaptive advantages, and produced the archaeological signature we observe as the emergence of behavioral modernity. This model is coherent, is supported by the general structure of the out-of-Africa dispersal pattern, and has the backing of most researchers in the relevant fields. What it does not specify, what it cannot yet specify, because the relevant genetics are not yet fully characterized, is which mutation in which gene producing which specific neurological change at which precise moment in the archaeological record. The explanatory structure is in place. The molecular content of the explanation remains to a significant degree a placeholder awaiting evidence that has not yet fully arrived. It is in this gap between the explanatory framework and the molecular specifics that the chromosome question and the textual record find their most interesting point of contact with mainstream science. If the chromosome 2 fusion is associated with a population bottleneck, and if that bottleneck overlaps temporally with the period of behavioral emergence, then the two events, the genetic reorganization and the cognitive leap, may be related not merely sequentially, but causally in ways that the current models have not yet fully mapped. This is not a claim that the Atrahasis is literally true, or that an external agent performed a deliberate modification. It is an observation that the genomic evidence and the archaeological evidence are pointing at the same approximate moment in human prehistory from two independent directions, and that the convergence of their pointing is not yet explained by an account that satisfies both bodies of evidence simultaneously. The chromosome bottleneck, the cognitive revolution, and the emergence of symbolic thought may all be aspects of a single transition that the current scientific frameworks are describing from different angles without yet having assembled a unified view. What the Sumerian texts contribute to this picture is not evidence in the scientific sense, but a structural parallel that is at minimum worth noting. The Atrahasis describes a being created with specific cognitive enhancements, wide understanding, the capacity for language, an orientation toward the symbolic and the procedural, that are then constrained the text implies by design. The compound nature of the created being, partly of the earth and partly of something else, produces precisely the tension between high cognitive capacity and biological limitation that the behavioral record of anatomically modern humans displays a species capable of symbolic abstraction, long-range planning, and the construction of complex social systems operating within a lifespan and a physical form that frequently appears to be working against rather than with those capacities. The back pain, the difficulty of childbirth relative to other primates, the mismatch between the brain's metabolic demands and the body's ability to sustain them. These are not in the evolutionary model features of design. They are the residue of rapid change outpacing the slower adaptation of connected systems. In the Sumerian model, they are something else. The marks of a creation performed in haste adjusted across failed attempts, and stabilized before all of its contradictions had been resolved. Neither account is complete. Both are pointing at something real. And the question of whether those two incomplete accounts are describing the same event from different sides is one that neither genetics nor ancient Near Eastern philology is currently equipped to answer alone, which may be precisely why it has remained open for as long as it has. The next trace does not come from Africa or from Mesopotamia. It comes from the place where the pattern, if there is a pattern left, perhaps its most unexpected physical signature. The library that was not read as a library, 97% of the human genome for most of the 20th century, was classified as non-functional. The term used in the technical literature was junk DNA, a designation that was less a scientific conclusion than an expression of interpretive frustration, a category for genetic material that did not appear to encode proteins, and whose purpose, if it had one, was not legible to the tools then available. The naming was honest in one sense. The researchers who coined it were not hiding anything, only acknowledging that the majority of the genome was doing something they could not yet read. What subsequent decades of work, particularly the ENCODE project, a coordinated international effort to map the functional elements of the human genome that published its major findings in 2012, has established, is that the non-coding regions of the genome are not junk in any meaningful sense. Approximately 80% of the genome participates in at least one biochemical activity. The non-coding sequences regulate gene expression, influence the timing and context of protein production, and contribute to the three-dimensional folding of chromosomes in ways that affect which genes are accessible for transcription and which are not. The genome on this picture is not a simple parts list. It is a regulatory architecture of considerable complexity, most of which is still being characterized. What the ENCODE findings do not resolve, what they have in certain respects made more rather than less complex, is the question of how this regulatory architecture came to exist in its current form. The mechanisms of genetic mutation and natural selection are adequate to explain the gradual accumulation of functional sequences over evolutionary time. What they are less obviously adequate to explain is the degree of interdependence and coordination that the non-coding regulatory network displays, in which sequences distributed across different chromosomes appear to function as components of an integrated system, rather than as independently evolved elements that happen to interact. The analogy used by some researchers in computational biology that the non-coding genome resembles in its structural properties a compressed information archive rather than an accumulation of independent modules is not a fringe position, but a description of an observation that the field is actively working to interpret. The genome follows in its statistical distribution of sequence elements patterns consistent with structured information encoding, including a distribution known as zippy law, which appears in natural languages in certain physical systems and in other domains where information is being organized rather than merely accumulated. Whether this means the genome is a language in any meaningful sense is a question that cannot currently be answered, but the observation that it shares statistical properties with structured information systems is not being made by people outside the scientific mainstream. It is being made by computational biologists working with the full data set. This is where the Sumerian texts offer an unexpected point of contact, not through the creation narrative of the Atrahasis, which has been examined at length in preceding chapters, but through a different document in the Mesopotamian corpus, the text known as the Sumerian King List. The King List is a genuine historical document copied and recopied across multiple tablet traditions that records the names and reign lengths of Sumerian rulers from the earliest period of Mesopotamian civilization through the historical era. Its reliability as a historical source is generally accepted by scholars for the post-flood portion of the list where those reign lengths are plausible and the names can be cross-referenced against other historical records. It is the pre-flood portion that has generated the most interpretive difficulty, because the reign lengths listed there are not plausible in any conventional sense. Pre-flood kings are recorded as having reigned for tens of thousands of years, figures like 36,000 years for the reign of Unmenlu-Ana, or 28,800 years for Dumuzid. These numbers are not presented as symbolic or approximate. They are listed in the same format as the post-flood figures, as though they are of the same kind only larger. The standard scholarly explanation for the pre-flood reign lengths is that they are mythological numbers, and expressions of primordial time in the Mesopotamian theological imagination, in which the earliest period of creation was understood to be qualitatively different from historical time, and in which the enormous figures convey not biological longevity, but the vastness of a time before time as humans experience it. This is a reasonable reading, and it is consistent with how other ancient traditions, including the biblical genealogies of Genesis, with their centuries-long lifespans, have been interpreted by scholars of ancient religion. The numbers are a different kind of claim, not a biological one. That position is defensible. What makes the king list's compression interesting? In the context of this episode is not the pre-flood numbers themselves, but the transition point. The moment the list marks as the flood swept over is followed immediately by a dramatic reduction in the recorded reign lengths from tens of thousands of years to hundreds, and then, across subsequent generations, to the historically plausible figures of the later Sumerian dynasties. The transition is not gradual. It is abrupt, marked by a single event, and the numbers on either side of it are of different orders of magnitude. Whether this reflects a genuine folk memory of a biological change, a reduction in lifespan associated with some event or transition in the deep human past, or simply the Mesopotamian scribal convention of marking the boundary between mythological and historical time with a dramatic numerical discontinuity, is a question that the text alone cannot answer. But the structure of the transition, a sudden compression of lifespan, immediately following a catastrophic boundary event, is a narrative structure that appears independently in the Hebrew tradition in certain Persian accounts, and in several other ancient textual traditions that have no documented literary relationship to the Sumerian king list. The pattern of a post-catastrophe reduction in longevity is not a Sumerian invention. It appears in various forms wherever ancient civilizations attempted to describe the difference between a primordial time and the time they themselves inhabited. Whether these traditions are each independently generating the same narrative structure, because the structure is a natural way of encoding the difference between mythological and historical time, or whether they are all preserving in distorted form some memory of an actual transition in the biological condition of the human lineage, that is not a question this episode can resolve. What it can do is note that the genome's non-coding regions, whose functional architecture is only now being fully characterized, and the ancient textual record's insistence on a dramatic transition in human longevity following a catastrophic event, are both pointing at the same blank space. The question of what the genome once did that it no longer does, or what it carries that has not yet been read. The ninth trace brings all of this into contact with a physical location, a site in southern Africa, where the ground itself may hold evidence that the timeline of human organised activity is considerably older than the consensus currently allows. The circles in the ground. From the air, the Mpumalanga Plateau in northeastern South Africa looks in certain aerial surveys and satellite passes like a landscape that has been marked, not by geology, not by the sorting of erosion and deposition, but by intention, by the deliberate placement of stone structures across an area of approximately 450 square kilometres in a density and a regularity that the surrounding terrain does not produce naturally. The structures are circular, built from the dolerite rock that outcrops across the plateau, and they are old enough that the stone walls have partially subsided into the ground. Their course is no longer cleanly vertical, but settled into the earth at angles that suggest considerable time has passed since they were raised. Estimates of their age have varied widely depending on the dating method applied and the assumptions built into it, with figures ranging from a few thousand years consistent with known Iron Age activity in the region, to numbers considerably larger produced by astronomical alignment analysis, and by the depth of the erosion patterns in the surrounding soil. The conservative estimate places the structures within the range of documented human civilization. The less conservative estimates do not. Michael Tellinger, a South African researcher who has spent more than a decade surveying and documenting the Mpumalanga stone circles, has published measurements suggesting the site complex numbers in the hundreds of thousands of individual structures interconnected by stone channels that function as pathways between circular enclosures and by larger arrangements that appear in aerial view to follow patterns consistent with organised agricultural or ceremonial land use across an enormous area. Mainstream archaeology has not validated the most dramatic of Tellinger's claims, and the dating figures at the upper end of his range, which would place the construction of the stone circles at 160,000 to 200,000 years ago, contemporaneous with the earliest anatomically modern humans in the African fossil record, are not accepted by the majority of researchers working in southern African prehistory. The structures exist. Their function, their precise age, and the civilization that built them remain subjects of genuine dispute rather than settled consensus. What is not disputed is the scale. The Mpumalanga complex, even under the most conservative dating, represents one of the largest concentrations of ancient stone construction in the world, and it has received a fraction of the scholarly attention devoted to far smaller sites in other regions. What draws the Mpumalanga complex into the orbit of this episode is not its age alone, but its location. The plateau sits directly above one of the richest gold-bearing geological formations in southern Africa, the Witwatersrand Basin. A sedimentary sequence laid down approximately 2.5 billion years ago that contains the largest known gold deposit on Earth and has produced since systematic mining began in the 19th century approximately 40% of all the gold ever extracted by human civilization. The gold is not metaphorically present in the region. It is structurally embedded in the geology beneath the stone circles in a concentration so exceptional that the Witwatersrand Basin remains, by every geological metric, the defining feature of the region's subsurface. Whether the builders of the stone circles knew this, whether the presence of gold in the ground was a factor in the location of the structures, is a question that cannot be answered from the archaeological record currently available, because the record of who built the circles and why has not yet been recovered in a form that permits that kind of inference. The co-location is a fact, its significance, if any, is not. But the fact sits alongside the Atrahasis narrative with an unsettling precision that is difficult to simply set aside. The Atrahasis locates the first human habitation, the Bitshimti, the place of making in the Abzu, a term consistently associated in the Sumerian geographical imagination with sub-Saharan Africa, and more specifically with the region of the Great Gold Deposits. The text describes the Agigi, the labour class of Anunnaki workers, as having operated in the Abzu before their rebellion and before the creation of the Adamu to replace them. If the Mpumalanga stone circles are the remains of an organised settlement in that region, regardless of who built them or when, then the textual record and the physical record are at minimum pointing at the same geography. That convergence could be coincidence. The gold deposits of southern Africa are not a secret, and a tradition that associated divine activity with a region of exceptional mineral wealth might have developed for entirely mundane reasons, having nothing to do with actual ancient habitation. Or the convergence could be something else. The archaeological evidence does not currently permit a determination. What makes this chapter the episode's highest point of unresolved tension is not any single detail within it, but the accumulation of directions that all the preceding material has been pointing. A genome with an anomalous fusion and a non-coding majority whose functional architecture is only partially characterized. A creation text that describes a deliberate biological modification producing a compound being in a location associated with gold extraction. A symbol distributed across ancient civilizations that may reference an anatomical structure whose properties are only now being measured. A behavioral revolution in the archaeological record that arrives faster than the preceding 200,000 years of human toolmaking prepared us to expect. And now, a physical landscape that ground itself in the region. The oldest creation narrative associates with the origin of the human being, marked by stone structures of uncertain age and unknown function sitting above the largest gold deposit on Earth. Documented but not explained, surveyed but not resolved. Not proof. A pattern. And the pattern assembled across genetics and ancient text and iconography and archaeology and geology produces a question that none of these fields, working alone or even in combination, has yet been able to dissolve. Whether the question points toward a history we have not yet recovered, or toward a very human tendency to find connections in noise that the universe did not place, there is something that the evidence as it currently stands cannot determine. That indeterminacy is not a failure of the inquiry. It is the inquiry's most honest result, and it is from that honesty, that genuine openness, that the descent towards sleep can begin. The landscape held at distance. Every field of inquiry develops over time a particular relationship with its own margins, the observations that fit within the established framework, and the observations that do not quite fit, that sight at the edges of what the prevailing model can comfortably accommodate. The relationship is not always adversarial. In the best practice of any discipline, the marginal observation is held carefully, neither dismissed because it is inconvenient nor promoted because it is interesting, but retained in a kind of productive suspension, while the field waits for the additional evidence that will clarify whether the anomaly requires a revision of the model or merely a refinement of its parameters. This is how knowledge actually advances, not through the dramatic overthrow of paradigms in the cinematic sense, but through the slow accumulation of anomalies that eventually become too numerous and too consistent to absorb within the existing framework without modification. The modification, when it comes, often reveals that the anomalies were not pointing at something entirely alien to the existing understanding, but at a layer of complexity within it that the previous tools were not sensitive enough to detect. What the preceding 9 chapters have assembled is not a case for any single alternative account of human origins. The evidence examined across genetics, ancient Near Eastern philology, comparative iconography, cognitive archaeology, computational genomics, and the physical landscape of southern Africa does not converge into a unified theory. It converges into a shared direction, a set of independently generated anomalies that all point toward the same unanswered question about the boundary between what we are and what produced us, without any of them being able to specify what lies on the other side of that boundary. That convergence of direction across fields with no professional reason to arrive at the same pointing is the most significant thing this episode has established, and it is also the most difficult thing to hold clearly in mind, because the mind that wants resolution will keep trying to turn the direction into a destination. Pull back far enough from the individual traces, and what becomes visible is something like a coastline seen from altitude, a shape that has coherence at the level of the whole, even though no single section of it examined up close looks like anything but irregular rock and water. The chromosome fusion, the Atrahasis procedural narrative, the distributed pinecone symbol, the behavioral leap of the cognitive revolution, the non-coding genome's emerging complexity, the pre-flood compression of the king list, the Mpumalanga stone circles above the Witwatersrand gold, each of these at ground level is an anomaly with a conventional explanation that is adequate but incomplete. From altitude they form a coastline. They suggest that the terrain they are tracing has a shape even if the shape cannot be fully mapped from any position currently available to us. The question of what produced that shape has generated over the past century of engagement with Mesopotamian texts and the past several decades of engagement with the human genome 2 broad categories of response. The first is that the shape is real but explicable within the existing frameworks, and that the sense of incompleteness in the standard accounts reflects the normal condition of active research rather than a fundamental inadequacy of the models. The second is that the shape is real and points towards something outside the existing frameworks, a history of the human lineage that the current disciplines are not designed to recover because they were not built with that history's existence as a working hypothesis. Both responses are held by people who have looked carefully at the evidence. Neither has yet produced a definitive account that the other cannot find grounds to question. What sits between these two responses in the space where neither the standard explanation nor the alternative is fully adequate is the oldest feeling in the history of human intellectual life, the sense that the record is telling us something we do not yet have the categories to hear. The Sumerians encoded their understanding of human origins in a literary form that we can translate but cannot be certain we are reading correctly, because translation is not the same as comprehension, and the conceptual vocabulary of a civilization separated from us by 5,000 years may not map cleanly onto our own. The genome encodes its history in a molecular form that we can sequence but cannot be certain we are interpreting correctly, because sequencing is not the same as understanding, and the functional logic of a regulatory architecture built over millions of years of evolution may not be fully legible to tools designed over decades of laboratory science. In both cases, the record is present. The reading of it remains incomplete. There is something worth noticing in the parallel between these two situations, the ancient text and the modern genome, that goes beyond the content of what each preserves. Both are archives. Both were produced by processes that encoded information across time in a form designed at some level to persist. The clay tablet was fired to preserve it against decay. The chromosome was replicated with extraordinary fidelity across hundreds of thousands of generations. The cell's molecular machinery correcting errors at a rate that allows the human genome to carry information across timescales that no other human archive approaches. In both cases, the archive has outlasted the context that would make it fully legible. The scribes who pressed the Atrahasis into clay are gone along with the tradition of interpretation that surrounded the text and gave it its full meaning. The evolutionary pressures that shape the non-coding genome are partially reconstructible but not fully recoverable, because the environments and the population histories that produced the current architecture cannot be directly observed. We have the archives. We have lost in different ways and to different degrees the keys. This is not a counsel of despair, it is a description of the actual epistemic situation, which is more interesting than either confident resolution or resigned uncertainty. The archive is present, the reading is ongoing, and the anomalies that resist the current reading are not failures of the archive. They're invitations to develop better tools, more sensitive instruments, more adequate conceptual frameworks for what the record is attempting to preserve. Whether what it is attempting to preserve includes a history of the human lineage that reaches back further and involves more than the current consensus allows, is a question that the next generation of research in archaeogenetics, in ancient Near Eastern studies in cognitive archaeology, and in the emerging field of non-coding genome function, will begin at least to address more directly than any previous generation has been equipped to. For now, from this altitude, the coastline holds its shape. The traces remain in their positions, the chromosome, the tablet, the carved stone, the circle in the ground above the gold. None of them have moved, none of them have resolved into certainty, and the question they share continues to hold open, patient as the clay that carried it across 5,000 years of time, waiting for a reading that is adequate to what it actually contains. The next chapter does not add to that landscape. It begins gently to dissolve it. The question beneath the question. At a certain depth of inquiry, the specific details, the chromosome, the tablet, the carved stone, the circle in the ground begin to lose their sharpness. Not because they become less real, but because the question they are pointing at grows larger than any of them, individually larger than all of them together, and the mind that has been holding them in careful relation to each other begins almost involuntarily to release its grip on the particulars and attend instead to the shape of what they were always circling. This is not a failure of rigor. It is what happens when a question has been followed far enough that it arrives at its own foundation at the layer beneath of the archaeology and the genetics and the textual analysis, where the question is no longer about chromosome structure or cuneiform translation, but about something older and less articulable than either. The question beneath the question, as it turns out, is not about the Anunnaki, or about who performed a genetic modification, or about what the pine cone symbol was intended to convey. The question beneath the question is one that every human civilization in the historical record has found some way to ask. In whatever symbolic vocabulary was available to it, what exactly are we, and does the answer include something that the available descriptions of us have consistently failed to capture? The Sumerians asked it by encoding the tension between the human and the divine into a narrative about creation and constraint, a being made from two substances, carrying the capacity of one and the limitations of the other, unable to fully inhabit either. The ancient Egyptians asked it by constructing an elaborate architecture of the afterlife in which the soul was weighed, judged, and either released or returned, as though the question of what a human being fundamentally is could only be answered at the moment when the biological component of the answer was no longer available. The Greek philosophical tradition asked it through the language of form and matter, soul and body, the eternal and the temporal, reaching toward a description of human nature that could account for the sense which the philosophers took seriously as data, rather than dismissing as sentiment that the human being is situated at a boundary between two kinds of existence rather than fully belonging to either. The modern scientific tradition asks it through the genome and the fossil record and the neuroscience of consciousness, working with instruments of extraordinary precision, toward a description of the human being that remains, after more than a century of intensive effort, incomplete in the specific domain that matters most, the domain of experience itself, of what it is like to be the kind of thing we are, which the third-person methods of empirical science approach asymptotically without quite reaching. Every tradition working from different materials with different tools toward different conceptual destinations has arrived at the same structural observation: the human being does not fit neatly into any single category that the available frameworks provide. We are biological organisms fully subject to the processes of evolution and metabolism and decay, and we are also something that stands at an angle to all of that, something that produces mathematics and music and the question of its own origin, and the persistent sense that the question matters in a way that goes beyond survival. The chromosome fusion is a biological fact. The Atrahasis is a literary document. The pine cone is a carved symbol. And beneath all three of them, irreducible to any of them, is the fact of the being that notices them, that holds them in relation to each other, and asks what they mean, and whose capacity to do so is itself the most remarkable anomaly in the entire record we have been tracing tonight. We will not resolve this tonight. The traces have been laid out as carefully as the available evidence allows, the counter-arguments have been given their full weight, and the pattern that remains is genuine but not conclusive. A shape in the data that points toward an unanswered question, without specifying what the answer contains. That is where the inquiry rests, not because it has failed, but because it has arrived at the actual boundary of what is currently knowable, and beyond that boundary, the only honest response is to hold the question open and continue watching. What the long history of human inquiry suggests, what the record of how knowledge actually advances as opposed to how it appears to advance in retrospect, is that the questions that persist across generations that survive the revision of the frameworks that originally generated them, and reappear in the vocabulary of whatever succeeds those frameworks, are usually the questions that are pointing at something real. The details change, the instruments improve, the conceptual vocabulary is replaced. The question remains wearing new clothes, asking the same thing it was always asking. There is a particular quality to the night sky visible from any location on Earth, where the ambient light is low enough that the ancient observers who built their temples to astronomical alignments and who pressed their understanding of the cosmos into wet clay would have known intimately, and that most people alive today have seen only rarely, or never, the depth of it. Not the brightness of individual stars, but the sheer dimensional quality of the field they inhabit, the way that looking up on a clear dark night produces not the sense of a ceiling decorated with lights, but the sense of an opening in. Something that has no bottom, a depth that the eye cannot measure, and the mind cannot fully contain, that produces in most people who attend to it long enough, something between awe and a very specific kind of vertigo. The ancient observers who built Bryn Celli Dudu to align with the midsummer sunrise, who oriented the shafts of the king's chamber toward Orion's belt, who pressed the movements of Jupiter and Saturn into clay tablets and tracked them across centuries. All of them were attending to that depth, trying to find in its patterns some correspondence with the patterns of human life, some indication that the two scales of existence, the astronomical and the personal, were in conversation with each other. Whether they were right to look for that correspondence is a question that science has not settled, because science has not yet determined what consciousness is, or where it sits in relation to the physical processes that accompany it. What the preceding chapters have traced is in the end a version of the same search, an attempt to find in the patterns of the genome, and the ancient text, and the carved symbol, and the marked ground, some indication of what we are, and where the boundary of that answer lies. The search has not produced a destination. It has produced a direction. And sometimes a direction held steadily in mind without the demand that it resolve into a place of arrival is sufficient not as a conclusion but as an orientation, a way of carrying the question forward into whatever comes next, whether that is further inquiry or simply the gradual release of attention that comes at the end of a long day when the mind loosens its hold on the particulars it has been managing, and the larger shapes that contain them become briefly and without effort visible. The final image waits at home in a specific place with a specific texture held in the dark. The tablet before the firing, in the British Museum in room 55, behind glass that reflects the ambient light of the gallery. Back at anyone who stands before it, there is a clay tablet approximately the size of a human hand. It is fired to a colour between ochre and sand, its surface covered in the wedge-shaped impressions of cuneiform script pressed into the clay when it was still wet, still responsive to the touch of the stylus, still capable of receiving the mark. The tablet is a fragment of the Atrahasis Epic, not the complete text, but a portion of it, the section that describes the moment before the creation of the human being, when the decision has been made and the materials have been gathered, and the process is about to begin. It has been in the museum's collection since the 19th century. Tens of thousands of people walk past it every year. Most of them do not stop. Those who do stop rarely stay long because the script is not legible, without years of specialized training, and what looks back at the viewer is not a readable text but a surface of marks whose meaning is present but inaccessible there in the object waiting behind the glass, carrying what it has always carried, patient in the way that fired clay is patient, which is to say essentially without limit. Consider what that object is held in its full strangeness for a moment before the mind resumes its normal categorizations. A human hand 5,000 years ago pressed a stylus into wet clay and recorded something that the hand's owner believed was important enough to preserve, important enough to fire the clay and store it to ensure that the marks would outlast the moment of their making. The hand did not know that the moment would outlast the civilization that surrounded it, that the city in which the tablet was pressed would become sand, that the language in which it was written would become extinct and then be painstakingly reconstructed by scholars, working 2.5 millennia later from a body of recovered fragments, that the tablet itself would travel from the ruins of Nineveh to a glass case in London, where it would be examined by people whose conceptual world the scribe could not have imagined. The hand knew only that the marks mattered, that what they encoded was worth the effort of preservation, that the clay should be fired. What the tablet carries across those 5,000 years of silence is a version of the same question that the genome carries in its non-coding regions, that the Nimrud reliefs carry in the gesture of the pine cone held toward the human forehead, that the stone circles of the Mpumalanga plateau carry in their arrangement above the gold, the question of what we are, and whether the answer is larger than the descriptions of us that any single moment in history has been able to produce. The tablet did not answer the question when it was pressed. It has not answered it in the 5,000 years since. What it has done is preserve the shape of the asking, the fact that the asking occurred, that someone found it important enough to encode in a durable medium and pass forward into whatever time would come after theirs. There is something in that gesture, the decision to press a mark into clay and fire it to make the temporary permanent, to hand something across a distance of time to a recipient who cannot be known or imagined, that is among the most distinctly human things in the entire archaeological record. Not the content of the mark, the act of making it for someone not yet born, the assumption built into the gesture that the future will contain minds capable of receiving what the present is attempting to transmit, that the chain of comprehension will hold across whatever intervenes. Every written document in the history of human civilization is an expression of that assumption. Every book, every inscription, every pressed clay surface is a bet placed on the continuity of the kind of being that finds marks meaningful and goes to the trouble of deciphering them. The bet has so far been correct. The marks have found their readers. The chain has held. What the chain carries at its oldest recoverable link is a story about a creation performed in haste, a being made from two substances carrying a tension between capacity and limitation that the text treats as the central fact of what was made. Whether that story is a memory, a metaphor, a theological argument, or something that resists all three of those categories, it has moved through 5,000 years of human time and arrived here in this room, in this moment in the mind of whoever is listening, which is to say that it has done exactly what the hand that pressed it intended. It has crossed the distance. It has found its recipient. Whatever it means, it arrived. The tablet sits in its glass case in London. The stone circles settle further into the Mpumalanga earth. The chromosome carries its fused structure in every cell of every body that will read these words or hear them, or hold them for a moment before letting them go. The question they all preserve remains open, not as an absence, not as a failure of inquiry, but as the space that the inquiry has honestly reached and honestly reported, the edge of what is currently knowable, beyond which the evidence does not yet extend. That edge is not an ending. It is a boundary, and boundaries held in the right light are among the most interesting features of any landscape, the places where one kind of terrain meets another, where the known gives way to the not yet known, where the question is still forming into whatever shape the next tool, the next text, the next sequence, the next careful observer will eventually be able to read. For now, the clay holds what it holds. The marks are there, the question is there, and the night is deep enough to rest inside without requiring it to resolve. Rest Moni. Now, traveller. The scar in chromosome 2 is still there. It was there before this episode began, and it will be there when the last word of it has dissolved into whatever the mind does when it stops listening and starts to drift. Nothing said tonight has changed the structure of that chromosome. Nothing said tonight has changed the firing of the clay or the angle of the pine cone held in Assyrian stone or the arrangement of the circles in the Mpumalanga earth above the gold. The evidence sits exactly where it sat before the first trace was named. What may have shifted slightly is the quality of attention brought to bear on it, the sense that these separate objects in their separate cases and their separate fields and their separate disciplines are not entirely unrelated, that they share a direction even if they do not share a destination. That shift is not a conclusion. It is something more like an orientation. The difference between facing a landscape with your eyes closed and facing it with them open, even if what the open eyes see is mostly darkness, and the suggestion of shapes at the edges of what the available light can reach. The shapes are there, the light is limited. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and holding them simultaneously without forcing one to cancel the other is perhaps the most honest response the evidence currently permits. There is a long tradition older than any of the texts examined tonight of sitting with what cannot be resolved, of allowing the unanswered question to exist in the mind, not as an irritant demanding remedy, but as something more like a companion, something whose presence indicates that the inquiry is still alive, still moving, still finding the edges of what is knowable, and reporting them accurately. Every civilization that pressed its understanding into a durable medium, into clay, into stone, into the carved face of a monument oriented toward a solstice sunrise, was doing something like this, acknowledging that the question exceeded the answer available in that moment and deciding to pass the question forward anyway, trusting that the future would contain minds willing to hold it. That trust was not misplaced. The questions arrived. The minds were here. The holding is ongoing. What we carry out of tonight is not an answer to what we are, or a confirmed account of what produced us. What we carry is the shape of the question itself, the particular outline it traces when the genome and the ancient text and the carved symbol and the marked ground are held in relation to each other and examined without the demand that they resolve. That outline is specific to this inquiry, to these traces, to the anomalies that each of them preserves in its particular medium. It is not a general mystery. It is this mystery, this set of observations, this configuration of things that do not quite fit the frameworks built to contain them. And perhaps that is sufficient for tonight. Perhaps the question held lightly at the edge of sleep does not require an answer, so much as it requires a holder, a mind willing to carry it forward without forcing it closed, willing to wake tomorrow with it still open, still pointing in the direction it has always been pointing. Patient as fired clay, quiet as the space between stars. There is a particular quality that the best questions share with the best sleep. Both ask nothing of the mind except that it release its grip on what it was managing and allow something larger than management to take over for a while. The chromosome will carry its fusion through the night. The tablet will sit in its glass case in London, holding its marks in the dark. The stone circles will continue their slow settlement into the Mpumalanga earth, indifferent to whether anyone has named them or dated them or agreed about what they mean. The question will remain where it has always been. Not outside you waiting to be found, but woven into the same biology that is already beginning to silo, already beginning the nightly process of releasing the day's accumulation of certainty and uncertainty alike into the longer rhythm of rest. Let the traces go one by one, the chromosome, the tablet, the pine cone held in stone, the circles above the gold, let them return to their proper distances, which are large, and their proper timescales, which are larger still. The body knows how to do this. It has been doing it every night for as long as there have been bodies, long before the question was written down, long before the clay was fired. Rest now, traveller, the record will hold, the question will be here when you return to it, and the night, which has no opinion about any of this, receives you as it receives everything completely and without condition, and without asking what you are made of.